The second scripture reading comes from the book of Genesis, chapter 45, verses 1 through 15, and then chapter 50, verse 20. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried out, "Send everyone away from me." So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him, so dismayed were they at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come closer to me." And they came closer. He said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are 5 more years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Hurry and go up to my father and say to him, 'Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not delay. You shall settle in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, you and your children and your children's children, as well as your flocks, your herds, and all that you have. I will provide for you there, since there are 5 more years of famine to come, so that you and your household and all that you have will not come to poverty. And now your eyes and the eyes of my brother Benjamin see that it is my own mouth that speaks to you. You must tell my father how greatly I am honored in Egypt and all that you have seen. Hurry and bring my father down here." Then he fell upon his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, while Benjamin wept upon his neck. And he kissed all his brothers and wept upon them, and after that his brothers talked with him. "Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Please pray with me. Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O God, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. This weekend is a weekend when many students head off to college. Not everyone, but a good number do. This weekend and certainly next weekend some have already left before this weekend, but it's happening right now. And there's some tears. Hear the crying even amongst us. No, there's some tears out in the community this weekend, and many of you know that experience, that there are tears in this transition mixed with some joy as well. I remember, I've done it 3 times, I remember after dropping off one of our children at the age of 18 at some institution of higher learning. It doesn't really matter which child or which institution, because the tears seem to come with all of them. But we dropped this one off, and then I was responsible for bringing that truck back, an old truck that they drove, and I was driving it. I was coming down 19 because it was a scenic route along the west coast of Florida, listening to the radio, doing great. You know, there's some joy in this too, I tell you. And all of a sudden, about Steinhatchee, the radio started playing Paul Simon's song, Graceland. And I found myself breaking into tears and just weeping. So much so that I had to pull off the road and cry. What was that about? Have you ever had a weeping moment like that? A moment where you're collapsing perhaps 18 years into one moment? A moment that catches you by surprise? Joseph did. Here in this story, this is a profound moment of crying that we just shared. So loud, it says, that Pharaoh could hear it. And that's a distance a ways. The commentators say about this story that this is a great story from Genesis. It really is the last portion of the Genesis material, the stories of creation and the stories of the matriarchs and the patriarchs. We come to the end of these stories now this summer. The next stories will be Exodus with Moses. Joseph's story is the end of these stories. And the commentators say, pastors, preachers, don't try to explain this. This is God's story. It's a holy story. I don't know if it's holy because it's in the Bible, or is it in the Bible because it's holy? But it's a holy story. And in that, I think we are saying that God's people across generations have told us, in this story, we have encountered, as we hear and remember this story, we have encountered the presence of God at work in our own lives, at work in our own stories. So the commentators say, preachers, don't try and explain this, just help them remember it. This is God's story. Now, a lot of this you may remember, certainly portions of it, thanks to Disney's popularizing of it, thanks to Broadway, and you may have the soundtrack of that well-appreciated musical, Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. You may remember portions of this just from good Bible study and Bible teachers along the way, but probably not all of it. And so it's important on the Sunday we get it to remember it. We only get 2 Sundays in the lectionary gift to remember all of Joseph's stories. It's a lot of material. So touch it for them again, preacher. Did you remember that after Joseph was thrown into the pit by his brothers because they couldn't stand his arrogance any longer, after they had sold him to some passing Ishmaelite traders for 30 pieces of silver and took his special robe and put animal blood on it and told his father, Jacob, that wild beasts must have killed him, after Joseph had gone with those Ishmaelite traders and was sold into slavery in Egypt, he ended up as a slave, a servant in the house of a particular Egyptian official, a man named Potiphar. Potiphar was responsible for some administrative area there in Egypt. And the Bible tells us that Joseph must have been particularly capable, administratively competent and capable. And if you have a gift for administration, that can take you a long ways in life. And Joseph's capabilities, even in his status, quickly came to light. And over time, even not a lot of time, Potiphar recognized it and gave him more and more responsibility until Joseph was responsible for everything in Potiphar's household, which was considerable. All of the economics and all of the logistics. Joseph was the chief executive officer for all of Potiphar's household. Do you remember that? That he rose from being in the pit to being a successful administrator for an Egyptian official. Do you remember that Potiphar had a wife? All right, Potiphar had a wife, and the Bible tells us in just a few brief words, Joseph was handsome and good looking. That's all it says about his appearance, all right? But Potiphar's wife noticed, and the Bible's clear about that. She noticed that he was handsome and good looking, and I guess while Potiphar was busy over at Pharaoh's court, she said to Joseph at least 4 times in this text, Joseph, come hither. But Joseph, because he was capable, because he was bright, doesn't. No, he knows it's better not to have anything to do with that. Even the 4th time, when he's in her room, and she says to him, Joseph, dear, come over here, he turns and starts to exit. And she reaches out to grab him, and his clothes come off because he skips out of the room so quickly. And she is indignant. So she goes to Potiphar and said that Joseph, he tried to force himself on me, and here are his clothes that he left in my room to be evidence of it. And once again, Joseph finds himself down in the pit. He goes from success a second time. It's a story of valleys and peaks for him, and now he's in Pharaoh's prison for something he didn't do. And there are two prisoners there, a baker and a cupbearer, who was a person whose job in the royal household was to present the king his chalice and to keep it full of wine. So he kept Pharaoh's chalice full of something to drink. But I don't know what they did wrong, but the baker and the royal cupbearer are both in prison with Joseph. And they share with him a dream they each have. And Joseph, who has the gift for interpreting dreams, tells them again what that dream means. He tells the baker, in about 3 days, Pharaoh's going to take your head. And he tells the cupbearer, in about 3 days, you're going to be restored to Pharaoh's work. And it happens that way. And the warden takes notice. Those guys are gone, but they don't remember Joseph. Then Pharaoh has a dream, a very important dream, a dream that bothers him. And he can't find anyone in his royal court or in the community to interpret it for him. Isn't there anybody who can make sense of this dream for me? And the warden says, you know, there's a guy down in the prison who has a gift for interpreting dreams, and they bring him up, and it's Joseph. And he tells Pharaoh, this is what your dream means. We're going to have here in Egypt 7 years of abundance, and then 7 years of famine. And Pharaoh, you need to save grain and food in the 7 years of abundance so that you'll have enough in the 7 years of abandon. You should save 1/5 of all the country's produce every year, and that way we'll get through the difficulty ahead. And Pharaoh likes this guy. He sees his administrative capability, and he says, thank you, Joseph. I'm going to make you the administrator in charge of the grain saving, the National Grain Recovery Act. And Joseph is at the top again. He's not only entrusted with that position, but his capabilities become so apparent quickly that he finds himself responsible for all of the administrative matters, all the logistics throughout the kingdom of Egypt. He is a very talented fellow. And after 7 years of plenty, putting 1/5 aside every year, it works out just as Joseph had predicted, and they have grain, food to feed those who are hungry. And they're hungry up to the north, over to the northeast in Canaan too. And that's where Jacob and his family still were. And they hit famine, and Jacob sends 10 of his sons down to Egypt to see if they can buy some grain there. He doesn't let them take Benjamin, his youngest son, because he's tender towards him, and he saw what happened to Joseph. So he keeps Benjamin there. But the other 10 brothers come, and they come before Joseph, but they don't recognize him because he's about 15 years older. But he recognizes them, and he manipulates them a bit. I'm not exactly sure what's going on in Joseph's head in this story, but he gives them the grain. But he also suddenly accuses them of being spies. I think you all are spies. You're here to see what Egypt's weaknesses are in this time of our vulnerability. And they say, all 10 of them, we aren't spies. We just came because we're hungry, here to buy grain. And he said, you are spies. And they say, no, we aren't. We came because our father sent us, and he kept the little brother back at home. And Joseph says, prove it. Go get the little one. If you bring me the little one, then I'll know you're telling the truth. He tricked them into bringing that youngest brother, his brother, Benjamin, back to him. And he pulled out Simon, and he said, I'm going to keep this brother as my guarantee that you all will come back. So they go back up to Canaan, and there they tell Jacob what happened. They eat off the grain. Jacob says, I'm not letting you take Benjamin back there. But the grain runs out, and they get hungry again. And finally, Jacob says, you better go back and take Benjamin with you if that's what you have to do. And again, they find themselves before Joseph in charge of Pharaoh's court. Again, he fills their bags with grain, but this time he plants in one of the bags his silver chalice, and he lets them get about 10 miles out of town on their way back with it, and sends then Egyptian warriors out to get them and say, somebody stole the king's chalice. And they bring him back, and they say, we don't have it, honest. And he has their bag searched, and there it is. Why does he do that? I'm not absolutely sure what's going on here for Joseph, but he's certainly tricking the brothers who tricked his father. And finally, he can't stand it anymore, and that's where we arrive at the text we arrived at today. He sends everybody else out of the room, and he says to the 10 brothers, now befuddled in desperate circumstances, he says to them, it's me, Joseph, the brother that you sold into slavery so long ago. And everybody cries. It's the crying, and Joseph cries so loudly that the Egyptians hear it in the palace next door. He kisses and hugs the necks of all the brothers, especially Benjamin, and he says, now you have to go back and get Jacob, Father Jacob, and bring him here too. We'll take care of you. We'll put you in the land of Goshen nearby, and we'll provide for you in every way. And so that's what they do. They come with their families, bringing back Jacob. Jacob is astonished that now Joseph is still alive, and they live in plenty and peace ever after. They live there until Jacob dies, and even finally Joseph himself dies there. Joseph comes to forgive his brothers, but interestingly in the story, he only forgives them formally after Jacob has died. It's in this last 50th chapter where he says to the brothers, you meant it for evil, but God intended it for good. And then he formally forgives them, only after Jacob has died. Why do we have this story? It's a holy story. It's wonderful literature. The community of faith tells us we have this story because every time we read it and hear it, in some way in our reflection on it and living with it, we encounter God at work in our own lives. This story, in some way, is our story. What does it teach us? There are multiple lessons depending on the listener's particular situation. For some, it teaches them mercy, and certainly that's a value in the story. For some, it teaches that God will ultimately provide. There's hope in this story. For some, it teaches do not hold grudges, forgive your siblings. But principally, it teaches this: God is at work in the stories of our lives. There's a whole lot of weeping in this story. Why? Why does Joseph weep so? It's because of his awareness that God has been with him all along. With him even when he was down in the pit, God was at work. With him when he was in a foreign house as a servant to Potiphar, God was at work in his story there. With him when he was in a foreign prison, God, it turns out, was at work there. With him when he was with the royal court of Pharaoh, Joseph comes to realize in a moment how God has been with him all along. In all of these spaces, God has been with Joseph, working in his story, even when it seemed dismal, even when it seemed with joy. Perhaps the knowledge that God was with him all of these times and over all of those years brought this weeping, this pivotal moment in the story of profound transformation. And Joseph is transformed. He becomes more generous, and with time he becomes more forgiving. He learns to let go of grudges. And you? Well, it's your story too. Where did God and God's work in your story create a moment of profound transformation? Where in your story did you suddenly find yourself in reflection and looking forward, aware of God's presence with you along the journey? Maybe it's still in front of you. What's in this holy story of God's people? Is there justice in this story? Yes, there's justice in Joseph's story. God's story is a justice story. Is there forgiveness in this story? Yes, it takes time, but Joseph ultimately gets there. And there's forgiveness in this story and in our story too. Is there grief, sadness in this story? Of course, it's an honest story. And sadness is an honest part of our stories. Is there joy in this story? Certainly. There's joy in the story of God's people. Is there mystery in this story? You bet. Mystery is always a part of the presence of God. Where have you encountered God in your story? Jacob died in Egypt. The text says that they took him back. Joseph and his brothers took Joseph's body back to Canaan, to Israel, and buried him there. Before he died, Pharaoh asked Jacob, the old blessing stealer, Pharaoh asked Jacob to bless him as well first, and he does. Jacob blesses Pharaoh before he dies, and then they take Jacob's body back to Canaan in Israel, and they bury it about 10 miles south of Jerusalem in a place called the Cave of the Patriarchs. And when Joseph dies, eventually, with Moses' help, they get his bones back to the same place, the Cave of the Patriarch. But Rachel, Jacob's beloved wife, Joseph's mother, Benjamin's mother, she was married about 6 miles south of Jerusalem. She was buried there, close by, another spot, a place called Bethlehem. This story isn't over yet.